Hey guys, hope you're doing well. So today we'll be going into Indian religious thought prior to the Buddha. And specifically, we'll be looking at an evolution that takes place from the Vedas through the Brahmanas and into the Upanishads, where there's originally a focus on sacrifice and how meditating on the act of sacrifice then led to the development of some of the key concepts we know in Hinduism, such as karma, reincarnation, Moksha, which is the liberation from the reincarnation cycle, and then the all important identification of the Atman or the self with Brahman or the supreme reality. And so we'll begin with the most important and the most celebrated Vedic sacrifice, that of the horse sacrifice. And this is actually really interesting when you look into this. So this was only celebrated by a victorious king who was then named the Universal Sovereign. And the sacrifice didn't just benefit the king, but actually benefited the entire world. And it was a sacrifice that actually spanned over a year's time, where a single stallion was chosen and was actually left with 100 other horses, but the stallion was guarded by 400 men who protected it and also prevented it from approaching mares. Now, the actual ritual itself lasted for 3 days. On the second day, numerous animals were immolated. And then finally, the stallion, which was then identified with the incarnated god Prajapati, was sacrificed by suffocation. Four queens, who were each accompanied by 100 female attendants, then walked around the body, and the principal queen lay down beside it, and while covered with a cloak, she simulated a sexual union. So a lot of different elements going on here, and we will see how this is all connected with one of the myths of creation that we find in Hinduism. But this specific horse sacrifice undoubtedly has its foundation in Indo-European culture. Traces are found among the Germans, Iranians, Greeks, Romans, and Armenians, but only in India did it play such a significant role in religious life. And the role, or the reason probably, is that it had such a cosmogenic significance. The horse was identified with the cosmos, or the god Prajapati, and the sacrifice symbolized the act of creation. Now, to see this, we have to delve into one of the creation myths of Hinduism, which is, in this case, found in the Rig Veda, Hinduism's oldest scripture, and it's in a famous hymn known as the Purusha, where a primordial giant, Purusha, and Purusha is the Sanskrit word for the man, where Purusha represents a cosmic totality, but is also portrayed as an androgynous being. And creation is the result of a cosmic sacrifice whereby the gods sacrifice Purusha, and then they dismember his body, and his dismembered body parts lead to the creation of other beings. But not just to the creation of animals, but actually the societal structure itself. So the social caste system arises from Purusha, the liturgy in Hinduism arises from Purusha, and then other aspects of the world, such as the earth, the sky, and even the gods. Now, this myth, the myth of an anthropomorphic divine being dismembered, and through that dismemberment, the world arising, is actually extremely archaic and attested in many parts of the world. In China, the same myth is found with the giant Pangu. Among the Germans, there's Imar, and then in Mesopotamia, we have Tiamat. So when it comes to the Rig Veda, this myth becomes the point of departure and also the doctrinal justification for the theory of sacrifice as it becomes elaborated in the Brahmanas. Now, the Brahmanas are texts that are dated from 1000 to 800 BC or thereabouts. And just as Purusha offered himself as a sacrifice in the Rig Veda, The Brahmanas have the god Prajapati suffer lethal exhaustion by creative labor, okay, through the act of creation. Now, although Prajapati and Purusha are technically distinct, and Prajapati is actually very archaic himself, in the Brahmanas, such as the Sapatha Brahmana and in other texts, Purusha and Prajapati are identified as the same being. In the beginning, Prajapati was the non-manifested unity totality, a purely spiritual presence, but desire or kama incited in him to multiply and produce himself. So specifically, what he did was he heated himself. Okay, so in Sanskrit that's tapas. He exercised himself, he heated himself to such an extreme degree that it emanated other beings. So other beings came about through his sweat, or through some other generative act. And tapas, or heat, became synonymous with asceticism, because it's through this asceticism, and therefore through this heat, that everything arose. And so by giving himself, right, Prajapati, by giving him his own self, and self in Sanskrit is Atman to the gods, he created another besides himself, and that is the sacrifice itself. And so it is also said that um, the joints of his cosmic body are also the seasons and the 5 courses of the fire altar. And so Prajapati is also identified with the year and the fire altar itself. And after this creative act, Prajapati's body becomes disfigured, disjointed. He is unable to rise, he cannot get up, and the gods have to cure him through a ritual act. And so the myth and its images translate the cosmogonic act into biological terms. Their own mode of being brings about the world, and life exhausts itself by its own duration. In other words, in the myth, what we see is a certain correspondence with what we see in the world itself, whereby life exhausts itself to a degree, right? There's entropy, there's decay, things naturally sort of devolve, and that's sort of what we're seeing reflected in this myth. And so every act of sacrifice in Hinduism, or in the Vedas specifically, is actually a repetition of the primordial act of creation, and thereby it guarantees the continuity of the world for the following year. This is the original sense of sacrifice in the Brahmanas, to recreate the cosmos that has been disjointed and exhausted by cyclic time, just as Prajapati was disjointed and exhausted through the act of creation. Through sacrifice, the world is kept alive. This is the decisive importance of the Brahmanic caste, okay, why the priests were so important and held so high in society, and how the Vedic gods actually in this time period are ignored and subordinated to the magical and creative powers of sacrifice that are found in the Brahmanas. So what we see here is the development of a fundamental new idea. Sacrifice not only restores Prajapati and ensures the perpetuation of the world, but sacrifice is also capable of creating a spiritual and indestructible being, the Atman, the self or the person. Sacrifice now also creates a new mode of being. In building the fire altar, the sacrificer identifies himself with Prajapati, or more specifically, the sacrificer and Prajapati are identified with the ritual act itself. The altar is Prajapati, and at the same time, the sacrificer becomes the altar. By the magical power of the rite, the sacrificer builds a new body for himself and obtains immortality. This means that after death he will return to life, to non-death, a modality of existence that goes beyond time. By reassembling Prajapati, The sacrificer performs the same operation of integration and unification on his own person, on his own Atman. Just as through sacrifice the god recovers his Atman, the sacrificer builds his own self, his Atman, for himself. The totality of ritual acts, or karma, when it is achieved and well integrated, is what constitutes the Atman. Thus, through ritual activity, the psychophysiological functions of the sacrificer are brought together and unified. Their sum constitutes the Atman. And so consequently, the Brahman, or the supreme reality, and Atman, the self, are implicitly identified. The discovery of the identity of the self, or the Atman, and the Brahman will be tirelessly exploited and thought after in the Upanishads. In the beginning, in the Brahmanas, Brahman designates the process of the cosmic sacrifice, but already in the Vedas, Brahman was thought to be imperishable, immutable, the principle and foundation of all existence. In other words, Brahman sustains the world, for it is at once cosmic access and ontological foundation. The Atharva Veda states, quote, "He who knows the Brahman in man knows the Supreme Being," unquote. The Brahman is identical with the Brahman caste, or the Brahman priest, because the priest knows the structure and origin of the universe. For the vedic, or the logos, can transform any person into the supreme reality, the Brahman. In the Brahmanas, the Vedic gods were radically devalorized to the advantage of Prajapati. And the authors of the Upanishads continued and completed this process, but they went even further. They did not hesitate to devalorize the all-powerful sacrifice itself, the very fundamental act in the Vedas. The Maitri Upanishad states that those who deceive themselves in the importance of sacrifice will be returned to the lower worlds. The spiritual crisis we find here seems to have been brought by meditating on the power of sacrifice. Just as Prajapati was reconstituted and recovered his person, the Atman, by virtue of sacrifice, so the sacrificer by means of ritual acts, or karma, unified his psychophysiological functions and built up his Atman. In the Brahmanas, the term karma denotes ritual activity and its beneficial consequences. But reflection on the ritual process of cause and effect inevitably led to the discovery that every act, by mere fact that it obtained a result, became an endless series of causes and effects. Once the law of universal causality was recognized in karma, the certainty founded on the salutary effects of sacrifice was destroyed. For the post-existence of the soul in heaven was the outcome of the sacrifice's ritual activity. But where was it that the products of all his other acts performed during his lifetime were realized? What then happened to the disincarnated soul, the Atman? It definitely could not have disappeared. There remained of it countless numbers of acts performed during life, and these constituted so many causes that must have effects, that must, in other words, be realized in a new existence, whether here on earth or in another world. The conclusion was inescapable. After experiencing a blissful or unhappy post-existence in an extraterrestrial world, the soul was bound to be reincarnated. This is the law of transmigration or reincarnation, samsara, as it's said in Sanskrit, which once discovered dominated Indian religious and theological thought. The only goal worthy of a wise man is obtaining deliverance, or moksha. Since every act, or karma, strengthens and perpetuates transmigration, deliverance can be gained neither by sacrifice, nor close relation of the gods, nor asceticism, nor even charity. Think how different that is from, let's say, Christianity. An important discovery was made by meditating on the soteriological value of knowledge already praised in the Vedas and Brahmanas, but this knowledge was esoteric knowledge of ritual. Ignorance of the sacrificial rituals led to death, according to the Brahmanas. This esoteric knowledge was disassociated from its ritual and theological context. Okay? Gnosis is now held to be capable of grasping absolute truth and destroying ignorance. Ignorance was known as avidya. Because of this avidya, or ignorance, men lived an irresponsible existence, not knowing the consequences of their karma. The cycle was now complete. Ignorance, or avidya, created and reinforced the law of cause and effect, karma, that in its own turn inflicted the unbroken series of reincarnations known as samsara. Fortunately, liberation or moksha from this infernal cycle was possible, above all by the virtue of gnosis. The discovery of the fatal sequence, avidya, karma, samsara, and of its remedy through moksha, by means of metaphysical knowledge, constitutes the essence of later Indian philosophy. And now we'll go into the identity of the Atman, or the self, with the Brahman, or the supreme reality. And when we think of this, we begin with trying to understand what the supreme reality is, or the first being. The first being is the one, the all, which alone explains the world, life, and the destiny of man. From the time of the Rig Veda, it was identified as Tad Ekam, or the one. The Brahmanas call it Prajapati or Brahman, but in these texts the first being is related to the cosmic sacrifice. The rishis, or the advanced, spiritual people in India, focused on apprehending it by meditation. The first being is unthinkable, limitless, eternal. It is at once the one and the all. Some identified it with the universe, others identified it as the limitless that sustains the world, life, and consciousness. Among the names for this being, the name Brahman took precedence. Brahman inhabits the heart of man, which implies identity between the true self and universal being. At death, the Atman of him who knows is united with Brahman, while the souls of the uninitiated, or rather the unilluminated, will obey the laws of transmigration. They will be reincarnated yet again into another body. Meditating on the Atman-Brahman identity helped the rishis decipher the mystery of creation in their own mode of being. Because humans are captives of karma and yet possess an immortal self, there exists in Brahman two seemingly incompatible modes of being: the absolute and the relative, the spiritual and the material, the personal and the impersonal. In the Upanishads of the Middle Period, developed what is already present in the Rig Veda to reduce the cosmic totality and consciousness to a single principle. The Katha Upanishad presents its cosmological ontology as the universal spirit of Purusha at the summit. Below it is the non-manifested, the avyakta, which acts as an intermediary sharing spiritual and material elements. And then still lower, the great self, or the Mahan Atma, the spirit manifested in matter. Deliverance consists in comprehending the paradoxical manifestation of the all and the one, and by doing so one frees himself from the wheels of cosmic process. From a different point of view, this cosmic process can be seen as a divine play, or in Sanskrit lila, or an illusion, maya. So here, my friends, we outlined in a very brief time this magnificent evolution that we see in Indian religious thought. And God willing, we shall develop it further. So hope you found this useful, and take care of yourselves.